Okay, so now we're going to talk about William Wordsworth, and in particular, a couple poems of his that deal with things like memory. Wordsworth is an interesting character. In some ways, he's sort of the lord of Romanticism. He's very, very famous, achieved great success in his lifetime, but there are also a lot of criticisms about him. We'll get to some of those later, but before that, I think we should just sort of dive into the poems that we have to look at here, because there's a lot of really great stuff, a lot of beautiful work to be discussed. So the first one up is his famous work, "Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey." The big thing at work in this one is that it's about him going back and revisiting a place that he hasn't been in a long time, a place that earlier in his life he'd seen great beauty there, and he'd sort of, saw it as a healing place, and now he's revisiting it and sort of considering what has changed in his life and how this place still has something to offer to him. One thing I think is that's really interesting about Wordsworth is that to really be able to enjoy his work, you have to sort of make it your own. You need to, when you read him, you should, more than with many of the Romantic writers even, try to compare the situation that he's in to something that's happening in your own life. So when he's talking about going back and visiting some place that he hasn't been in a long time, but it's someplace that has meaning for him, it's probably going to be helpful for you to actually try to do the same thing. Think of some place that you haven't been in a long time that has a lot of meaning to you, and what it would be like if you went back to that place again. I think that trying to turn him inwards really allows the types of things that he's talking about to blossom in a way that they aren't really going to leap off the page as much if you just look at it as a work. He's not necessarily, like somebody like Blake or like Coleridge, where the action is, going to be really fast. You sort of have to work with it a little bit more. It's a little bit more meditative as it is. So basically, in this poem, Tintern Abbey, one of the big things that it has about it is this idea that that beautiful memory that you have is something that is going to heal you even from afar, even when you're far away from it, and even when you yourself are suffering through bad times, that the memory of beauty sticks, and that it will for years. As he says here, it says, "Though absent long, these forms of beauty have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration." What that sort of is discussing is that idea that even though he hasn't been there for a long time, this memory of this place has stuck with him, and that even in these sort of places, in lonely rooms, amid the dim, he owed to them sensations sweet, that those good feelings remained, that they were still there with him, even though it's been a long time since he's experienced them firsthand. One thing you'll probably notice is that what I just read, it's long. There are a lot of long sentences at work here, and you just sort of have to, work through them to kind of, try to untangle them a little bit, because one of Wordsworth's big ideas that he discussed in an essay, the preface to Lyrical Ballads, that book that he shared with Coleridge, is the idea that poetry and prose, that there's not necessarily a big difference there, and that there should be some sort of unity to these ideas, that you can feel free to, go on and have sort of the common speech of the world, and that you can just sort of be more effusive in poetry than perhaps people would have thought allowable before. Some other things he talks about here, it says, in which the burthen, which means burden, of the mystery, in which the heavy and weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. So he's sort of talking about that sort of beauty that can come from memory. Some other things that he discusses that are really fascinating is, he discusses how in this moment there is life and food for future years. That when you are young, it says when you are young, you oftentimes are more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing that he loved. So when you're young, you're sort of like, it's like you're running away from something constantly rather than running to something. And now that he's older, he sort of recognized that. He knows that. He sort of is aware of it. Another thing that he talks about is, it says, "For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, not harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue." So when he was young, he just saw the nature for what it was. He just saw it and it was just pretty. But now when he sees it through the lens of, all the sort of suffering in the world, all the things that have happened in the world, and that this sublimity, this sort of beauty that you get from that recognition of how these things work together, that sort of uplifts nature in and of itself. So there's a lot of intrigue there, and there are a lot of really complex ideas, and they're sort of straightforwardly put, but in this entangled language. So you have to sort of work at it a little bit. From there, the poem moves on to discuss the fact that not only is he back at this place by himself, but he's at this place with his sister. And he's sort of like looking at his sister, and she's young, and she has the youthful magic about her. It says, "Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister." So he's sort of talking about how he can look at her, seeing the beautiful landscape, and that in that, he can sort of recognize that youthful vigor once again for the first time, that this nature, this beautiful nature shall, be something that is also going to provide for her the way it has provided for him. He even exhorts, he says, "Let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk." So it's all about, her being able to experience the beauty that he has and the joy that he gets from realizing that she is going to be able to experience that beauty. Okay? And then by the end of this poem, one of the big sort of themes that we get here is the idea that we shouldn't forget the good times, that even when we're going through something tough, even when life is difficult, even when there is suffering that's going on, that we should, more than anything, think back on those places that we once were, those places that gave us happiness and satisfaction, and that if we do think back on those places and those things, that's where we're going to be able to achieve and recognize some sort of beauty, some sort of loveliness, and that we should be willing to go back to that. As it finishes, just say, "Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake." So he's sort of thinking on this place above Tintern Abbey, this lovely, beautiful landscape, and how now it has even more meaning and beauty for him, because it's not just his anymore, it's also his sister's. So there's a lot of gorgeousness there. There's a lot of, beauty, and the idea of memory and the idea of sharing beauty and being able to sort of experience it again. So again, just like I mentioned, think back in your life and how there is a place that works like this within your own life, and sort of consider that and consider what it would be like to bring, a young person there to see it. And if you make the poem yours in that regard, the sort of deeper insights that it has about the nature of memory and its healing power will, have more validity for you. So the other poem we're going to be talking about is just a little tiny one. It's not nearly the monstrosity of Tintern Abbey. It's called "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." This poem, has sort of it's kind of goofy in a way, which I think is something that's sort of endearing about it. With Wordsworth, sometimes he almost kind of veers into corniness. Some scholars would probably say I just blasphemed by saying that, but I think it's legit. This idea that wandering lonely as a cloud, there's sort of a corniness to it, but it's also kind of beautiful, to sort of think about that idea. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils." So it's sort of this idea of viewing, in two ways. One, viewing a cloud going over and encountering this field of daffodils, and this cloud in and of itself sort of being able to witness that beauty. But then it's also a metaphor. I wandered lonely as a cloud. So it's not really the cloud. It's that you are wandering and just sort of along the fields, and then you see a host of golden daffodils, and you see the beauty of all of these flowers. And that these flowers are so gorgeous and wonderful. And then sort of in the same theme, these poems are linked together in a sense, in the same theme as Tintern Abbey, that basically encountering this sort of beauty is something that's going to be helpful and delightful for him in the future. As it says in the last stanza, "For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils." So basically, when he's lying on his couch, and he's in vacant or pensive mood, when he's just sitting there thoughtful and somewhat dolorous, that he can actually think back on this vision of all of these flowers sort of like bouncing in the breeze and the beauty of that, and that's going to be something that's going to make him feel good. So again, it's sort of like that idea of memory. And in some ways, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is kind of the perfect archetype of the romantic poem. It just sort of has all of these romantic ideas of like nature and memory and youthfulness and all of that sort of stuff at work in them. So I mentioned that Wordsworth is somewhat a divisive figure. I also said that he, was the partner of Coleridge in lyrical ballads. One thing about Wordsworth is that as a youth, he had all this sort of like revolutionary feeling, and he was the forerunner of this sort of mode of thought, and a big mover and shaker in the literary world. But then over the course of his life, he actually kind of became a symbol of the establishment. He actually was, sort of the laureate. He was super famous. He was, praised by everyone. And that because of this praise, he actually ended up being kind of hated by some people and sort of looked down on as somebody who turned away from his initial morals. Like Lord Byron, for example, mocked him. And Shelley sort of wrote, in a sense, sort of like an elegy for his dead ideals. So both of these people and many others sort of view him as sort of like somebody who lost his way, somebody who, as he got older, sort of became increasingly sort of conservative and less romantic. In a sense, that's kind of beside the point, but he dealt with his own tragedies in his life. His mother died when he was 8 years old. His father died when he was 13 years old. He actually had a daughter in France who he had to leave behind when France and England went to war. So there were lots of, things that went on in his life. But he's definitely somewhat a divisive figure. But despite that, it does nothing to take away from the fact that in Tintern Abbey and I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, he does a lot to discuss the beauty of memory and how it can serve us well even in times of hardship.